I have to ask, though, wouldn't it be even better if we could listen to the animals? For some years now, I've had a personal spiritual practice based on that of the late Harry Schofield, who was minister of this congregation when this chapel was built, and a man of real spiritual depth. I try to get up even before the sun does and greet the dawn. Even here in the city, especially if I go out walking toward Golden Gate Park, which is 4 blocks from my home, or just open the window. At that hour, one hears the birds, the dawn chorus. Sometimes the soloist is the loud caw of a crow. But then I remember that that was Harry's favorite bird. He says so in a film about his spiritual practice when he speaks to his granddaughter about it. I think it's because the crow is assertive. Reminds me of that great listener to animals, Bernie Krause, whom I heard interviewed not long ago on KQED. He is a jazz musician turned soundscape ecologist, now 84, and lives up near Santa Rosa. He's also the author of a book with the title that I borrowed from my homily. It's subtitled, Finding the Origins of Music in the World's Wild Places. In the 1960s, Bernie succeeded Pete Seeger, good Unitarian, by the way, as the tenor in the folk quartet The Weavers, and then moved here to San Francisco. With experience as a recording engineer, Bernie and his friend Paul Beaver became real pioneers in early electronic synthesizer music. And then in 1968, the same year this chapel was constructed, perhaps in reaction to the human control over sound that they were asserting, Bernie and Paul went out to nearby Muir Woods to just sit and listen to the natural sounds of the redwood forest. It was a revelation for them both. I think of the beloved hymn that we sang at the 11 o'clock service this morning. Morning has broken. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Or the profound book by Unitarian philosopher of religion and ornithologist Charles Hartshorne called Born to Sing, an interpretation and world survey of birdsong, published back in 1973. Charles quite successfully showed in that book that not all birdsong can be accounted for, just as mating behavior or as claiming feeding territory. Some, perhaps especially the dawn chorus, seems to just be an assertion of joy in the gift of being, a way of singing praise for the gift of being alive and able to greet a new day. That, my friends, is the basis of all authentic and deep spirituality, as Harry both knew and demonstrated. And it probably has its own evolutionary use for survival. Certainly better than any despair, which is way too easy. Not that we shouldn't worry, of course, or grieve, or mourn at the many losses of habitat and companions we were given in this creation. Our animal friends seem to do that as well. I remember going with the choir and Mark to South Africa and ending up in a reserve where there are 80,000 elephants and where 2 were pointed out to us as being in mourning. In some ways, Bernie's amazing collection of recordings made in wild places all over the planet, from the mouth of the Yukon River in the Arctic to a park in the Central African Republic. That collection made over the last 50 years is an act of empathy and warning that the great animal orchestra is gradually growing more and more silent due to the loss of habitat, extinctions, and the impact of human-caused climate change. If you hurry, you can still this week experience a 90-minute immersive experience of Bernie's work down at the Exploratorium on Pier 15. I saw it and heard it and felt it myself just a few weeks ago. The fact that it's closing seems somehow fitting given the urgency of our planetary crisis. The recordings all come from wild places where the call of mother elephants to their children both bellows in sound and then vibrates in color as transposed electronically, almost like a warning signal, which is certainly what all places in our such places in our world are facing. Each recording breaks down as to frequency, timbre, voice, and duration, and throws up in lights traveling around the walls the different and identified sounds of, well, insects humming, the ribbit of frogs and toads, the call of various bird species, and then the growls and the howls of felines and canines and even larger mammals. I don't know what, if any, relationship Bernie maintains with his Jewish heritage, but if he were here this morning, I would dialogue with him a bit, not only about how indigenous and Buddhist teachings encourage a reverence for all sentient beings, but as my homily last year on this occasion emphasized, it's also the season to discuss the Jewish festival of Sukkot, which ended recently, when Judaism encourages its followers to not only celebrate the harvest, but to dwell in a booth decorated with the fruits of the earth and live in a flimsy, fragile little tabernacle, listening to the voice of creation and readjusting one's priorities. A booth open always on at least one side to welcome others to the fragile table that is given us to share. It seems to me also not an accident that the Feast of St. Francis falls in this season, the patron saint of our fair city. He was called, by the Greek author Nikos Kazantzakis, the only true Christian after Jesus. Francesco Bernardone, in the Umbrian hill town of Assisi, is said to have converted a wolf from preying upon the people of the nearby town of Gubbio. But at least some interpreters wonder whether it wasn't Francis who was converted by the wolf, rather than vice versa. For certainly, the creatures with whom we share this planet are capable of softening our hearts and recalling us to the need for companionship, for compassion, and for the basic joy simply in being alive. Back in 1995, when I was president of our Unitarian Universalist Association, I found that I had also inherited the title Honorary President of the World Conference on Religion and Peace. A rather hefty burden, because my predecessor, Dana Greeley, had co-founded what is now just called Religions for Peace, along with a Buddhist leader from Japan, in an interfaith effort to reduce the dangers of the nuclear arms race. In '95, at a meeting of religious leaders in Rome, it fell to me to open the meeting and then have His Holiness John Paul II and Buddhist leader Nikkyo Noano of Japan elected as the co-moderators. And then they would turn over active leadership of the meeting to then Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan, a leading Muslim thinker about interfaith cooperation and a leading historian of Christianity in the Middle East. Just in case you don't think there's any interfaith cooperation going on. We all then heard from environmentalist Peter Goldmark, who was then president of the Rockefeller Foundation, which had helped to fund the meeting. And he stood and challenged us with the news of extinctions and the breakdown of fisheries, and asked us if we did not feel called to lead a spiritual response. Something I said, perhaps? Well, the point is that after this, I found myself with an espresso in hand, standing with Francis Cardinal Arinze of Nigeria, who was the head of the Vatican's Office of Interfaith Relations. And like an assertive crow, I approached him, introduced myself, and asked if His Eminence did not possibly agree with me that we would all be held accountable by our Creator for all the species that we were given as companions who were going extinct due to our greed, colonialism, and exploitation, and our refusal to limit the growth of the human population. Then 6 billion, now predicted to peak at 10 billion in the late 2000s. In case you can't figure it out, this was a bit of a dig at Catholic opposition not only to abortion, but to contraception. And Arinze responded by saying that when he went back to his village in Nigeria, where he was born, he had to mourn with his nephews and nieces and their children the loss of the hum of the insects, the call of the birds, the sounds of the animals in the forest that he himself had known as a young child. And then he added, but you know, there's such a thing as spiritual ecology. And in my village, there are now 3 spiritual forces. One is the indigenous faith, sensitive to nature but focused on fertility. Children seen as insurance for one's old age, and so many are had. Or Islam, which has many good aspects but also allows men to have 4 wives. And the Christian commitment to chastity for some of us, monogamy for those who marry. It makes it seem rather sound, don't you think? And then surrounding all spirituality, the materialism, constantly coming in from the marketplace and driving us further and further from the spirit that inhabits all of creation. I came away thinking, boy, would I like that guy to be Pope. But of course, he was not. Too black, too soon, whatever, too like a crow on the telephone wire. These days, as birds of a feather, ethnically, religiously, or ideologically, we are all too often given to listening only to the voices of people like ourselves in self-isolated places on the planet. This is true here even in the cosmopolitan People's Republic of San Francisco, where even slight variances on what is considered correct can often cause courageous voices on the telephone wire to be dismissed as unworthy. I hope that our dominant species, still struggling for a sense of interdependence and peace, can learn to listen to voices other than our own. It may have to lead to a sunset chorus in which both voices of mourning and sounds of silence are heard, before we again begin to rejoice in the simple gift of being and rise at dawn to hear it, before a new era on Earth in which we humans do not dominate but practice good stewardship and find companionship not only with one another, but with all those critters of other species whose birdsong, meows, doggy licks, cuddles, yelps of appreciation help us through our own days.